talking about barriers of communication. Now we know how significant it is for a communication to be an effective communication. And in order to make sure that it is an effective communication, we should make sure it is barrier-free. And in order to make it barrier-free, we should know what are the types of barriers so that we can avoid. So today, through this video, we'll try to discuss barriers of communication. And these are 9 types of barriers of communication.
So the first barrier of communication is physical barrier. Now physical barrier is the most concrete barrier, or a barrier that has often hindered or distorted our communication in our day-to-day lives. Now physical barrier occurs when a physical object turns into a barrier. It can be anything. It can be a wall, door, or a glass partition, or anything that hinders or obstructs your communication from being it an effective communication, and such a barrier is called physical barrier.
Mango juice, mango juice, mango juice, mango juice.
So the example clearly displayed that the sender wanted to send a message to the receiver who was on the other side of the room, and the room was divided by a glass partition. Now in the example we saw that the sender was trying to send a message to the receiver and asking for the mango juice, but since the physical barrier, which was the glass partition here, the message was not clearly received by the receiver, and what she understood was that the sender actually wanted the bottle of water or the thumbs up can. So this happens when there's a physical barrier. Your communication gets distorted and it gets ineffective and unclear, and such a barrier is called a physical barrier. Now the next barrier of communication is perceptual barrier. Now perceptual barrier is very different from physical barrier, as there is no barrier in the physical form, but the barrier is actually in the mind of a person who is perceiving a situation. So when you perceive a situation where your mind is tied to a perception, there is certainly going to be a barrier in the communication, since that perception affects the communication and makes it ineffective and distorts it. So such a situation or such a barrier is called perceptual barrier.
यार ये टाई बांधना कितना डिफिकल्ट काम है.
वो हर्ष है, उसको बोलना, उसको आता होगा.
उसको कहाँ आता होगा? परफॉर्मेंस में तो देखा नहीं.
हाय सर, हाय ज्योति.
हाय.
क्या कर रहा है? टाइट टाइट.
हाँ यार,
लाना भाई आती है, मुझे बांध देता हूँ ना.
तुझे आती है?
तू दे तो सही, बताता हूँ तेरे को कैसे बांधते हैं. देख.
So what we saw in the video was that a person who was trying to make a tie for himself had a perception about the other person, that since he had not seen the other person in formals any time before, he would not be knowing how to make a tie, and therefore he did not communicate with that person and ask him whether he know how to make a tie. And so in this way, when you have a perception about somebody, it affects your communication and it acts as a barrier. So this is what is exactly meant by perceptual barrier. So the next barrier we are going to talk about is the emotional barrier. Now every one of you must have come across a situation when you would have realized that when you are actually feeling low or sad, you are not able to communicate properly. You are not able to find the exact words and exact manner in which you can send the message out to the receiver. Or similarly, when you are angry with someone or your emotional state is not really normal with someone, you cannot give the right message. Either you exaggerate the words too much, or the emotion of anger takes over and the communication is not done properly. So the next barrier we'll be talking about would be emotional barrier, and the definition of emotional barrier could be, it occurs when a person is not able to communicate effectively because the effectiveness of communication is hindered by his or her emotions. So we'll be seeing an example on emotional barrier of communication.
चलो काम कर रहे, टॉम एंड जेरी.
चल. 1997 से मेरे 2 बेस्ट फ्रेंड बन गए, एक तू और एक टॉम एंड जेरी।
क्या बात कर रहा है यार। क्या प्लान है वीकेंड का?
कहीं चलते यार।
गाइस ये तुम्हारे प्रेजेंटेशन का टॉपिक।
एक
यार 5 पॉइंट है, एक काम करते हैं, पहले 2 मैं ले लेता हूँ।
नहीं, पहले तो मैं लूं।
अरे यार वो टफ है, तुझे प्रॉब्लम
चल
होगी।
ठीक है।
2 पहले 2 मैं लेता हूँ, बाकी के नीचे के 2 तू ले ले, और एक जो बाकी रहेगा ना वो देख लेंगे जिसको।
ठीक है, जिसको मिल गया वो बता देगा।
ठीक है ना?
ओके
चल तो अपने ये कर लेंगे।
श्योर।
गाइस तुम्हारे नए प्रेजेंटेशन का टॉपिक।
वापस 5 पॉइंट, एंड के 2 ले रहा हूँ, ऊपर के 2 तुझे करना तो करना।
और बीच का
मुझे क्या पता, तू जाने।
देख लेंगे।
So what we saw in this video was when these two friends had everything right between them, their state of emotion was perfect, and at that point of time the communication was very clear and very effective. However, when they had a fight or after they had a fight, their state of emotion was anger towards each other, and after that they could not communicate well. The communication process was not clear and they could not sort out what to do about the remaining point that they had to present on. And this shows that how state of emotion, this allows a communication to be done effectively and appropriately. Now, like they say, the world is shrinking and globalization is at its peak. This creates a very likely chance that you would have to interact or communicate with somebody who comes from a different culture, who practices a different culture. And it is very likely that your communication might get ineffective or get distorted due to the cultural differences between you and that person. Such a barrier in communication is called cultural barrier. So the exact definition of cultural barrier is when culture differences hinders the communication and makes it ineffective. We term it as cultural barrier. Now in the video we saw that an Indian person is reading a book in the library and a Chinese person comes and greets him. Now it is a cultural and traditional practice in China that when you greet someone you bow down and greet. And this person from China has exactly done what he's done to the Indian person in the library, but the Indian person has actually failed to figure out what is this Chinese person trying to do. And even when he does it for the second time, the Indian person has failed that this person is actually trying to greet him. So before there is any communication happening between them, there is already a false impression that is impressed upon the Indian person regarding this Chinese person. So in this way, the cultural differences hampers the communication, and that is what we have exactly seen in this video. Now the next is status barrier. Status barrier occurs when there is difference of position in hierarchy or difference of status between two people at a workplace, and because of this status difference they cannot communicate to each other. The example will give you a better idea.
आपका अपॉइंटमेंट है?
अर्जेंट काम है,
आप ऐसे नहीं बन सकते मैम, बिजी है।
कुछ करिए आप, प्लीज अर्जेंट काम है।
जैसे मैम फ्री हो जाए मैं उनको इन्फॉर्म करता हूँ, वो आपको कांटेक्ट करेंगे।
The example clearly demonstrated that since there was difference of position in the hierarchy, the person who was at a low managerial hierarchy could not communicate to the boss or to the person who was at a higher position of hierarchy. So when such a barrier is occurred, we term it as status barrier. The next barrier is language barrier. Language barrier occurs when people who have no language in common attempt to communicate with each other. The difference of language turns out to be a barrier and the communication is distorted.
खड़ी खम्मा साहब।
हूँ क्यों?
खड़ी खम्मा।
बेल समझ नहीं पड़ती।
कठे हूँ आयो है तू?
हूँ कठे हूँ के यार?
कठे हूँ आयो है तू?
मारू नाम हर्ष है।
हर्ष कौन सो गाँव?
હું કહે છે સાવ ગાંડા જેવી છે.
We saw in the example that two students were trying to communicate with each other, but because they did not have the common language, they could not communicate further. Thus, language here acts as a barrier and obstructs the communication. Such a case is known as language barrier. So the next barrier is gender barrier. Now, as the title suggests, gender barrier occurs when the communication is ineffective between two genders. This barrier will be well explained by the example.
गाइस आज सैटरडे है तो चले कोई पार्टी करने.
आज
नहीं नहीं नहीं, आज तो हमारी पहले से ही कोई पार्टी प्लान है.
तो हम लोग भी ज्वाइन कर लें.
नहीं 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 प्लीज. हाँ
क्यों, हम क्यों नहीं आ सकते?
अरे हमारी वो वाली पार्टी नहीं तुम लोग सोच रहे हो.
हाँ नहीं यार.
Now we saw that the group of boys could not communicate effectively to the group of girls because there was a barrier of gender here. So when the communication gets distorted due to the gender differences, such a barrier is called gender barrier. The next barrier is fear barrier. Now how often we see that since the element of fear is involved, we cannot communicate well. So when we cannot communicate well due to that element of fear present, the communication gets distorted, gets ineffective, and such a barrier is called fear barrier.
नेक्स्ट मेरा इंटरव्यू है, पता नहीं क्या होगा, बहुत डर लग रहा है यार.
ज्योति बहन.
Yes sir, coming. Sir, मैं coming.
Yes, come in. Did I ask you to sit?
Sorry sir.
Okay, you may have your seat now.
Thank you sir.
So now we already have your file, but then to ask you, what is your educational qualification?
Sir, Oro University.
I'm asking you your educational qualification.
Oh, I'm sorry sir. I mean Masters in Business Administration.
Okay. Why do you think you should get this job?
Sir, because I think I manage things well.
That is it?
Yeah, sir.
Okay. And how much pay do you expect from this job?
Pay 1,000.
Yeah, 1,000 rupees.
No, I mean 15,000 to 20,000.
Okay. This is it for now. We'll contact you if we feel you're good for this job. You may be. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
This is what happens when you have phobia or fear. You cannot communicate well at interviews.
Like we saw in the example, the applicant cannot communicate well with the recruiting jury because she had the element of fear involved in her communication. So when there is fear, you cannot communicate well, and such a barrier is fear barrier. The next barrier is noise barrier. Now, as the name suggests, noise barrier is a barrier to communication when any unwanted sound interrupts the communication and makes it ineffective. We saw in the example how unwanted sound, which is noise, acted as a barrier in the communication. The girl could not talk on the phone because of the noise that was around her. So when unwanted sound or noise distorts or makes the communication ineffective, it is said to be noise barrier.